Hello, I'm Sandy Allnock, and today I'm going to be painting a watercolor painting of this boat and its buoy. I just love this photograph, and I, in my previous video, did sketches, thumbnail sketches in graphite and watercolor, and talked through what I was thinking while I was doing those sketches so that I could be prepared for doing this painting. And this is the brush that I'm going to be using, one brush for the whole thing. Colors and everything are listed below, and the photograph is listed below, but I will have it on screen as you're watching. But if you want to download it, you can go get it for yourself. So if you are painting along, I hope you have your sketch all ready. This is the brush that I'll be using. It's called a silver point brush, but not because the head of the brush is silver pointed or anything. It's because of the other end of it. And I will be doing a silver point drawing soon within the next couple of videos, so stay tuned for that. But the brush is kind of a mop, but they call it a quill. And so I am just getting to know this brush to see if I like it. And for the most part, it's pretty good. It has lost a couple of hairs. And I am not thrilled when a brush loses a couple of hairs, but it lost a whole bunch in the first time I painted something with it. And this time, only one hair in the entire painting, which was a great improvement. So maybe it's about done shedding. Let's hope. Well, after doing my thumbnail sketches, I had decided that I was going to start with the thing that I wanted to stay most pure, which is that really bright red-orange type of buoy. The colors I'm using are New Gamboge with Anthraquinoid Scarlet, and I'll add some Quin Rose to it as well. Because I realized as I was looking at the photograph, there's something that's a little more pinkish at the top side where it's a little lighter, so I thought I'll put in some very thin type of super pink and then morph that into the oranges and the reds down below. But this brush holds so much water. It's a challenge to figure out what to do with all that water and all that paint. So here I was trying to lighten it. I wanted to see if I could leave a white highlight at the top of the buoy, and that didn't work as well as planned, but you'll see how it plays out as we go. I started adding more Anthraquinoid Scarlet down at the base of the buoy and trying to give it some roundness. There is some texture in the buoy, but I want to keep from getting too fussy with it, so I want to try to see if I can leave it as simple as I can, at least in the first pass, and then add more later. The reason I'm starting with the buoy is so that I don't contaminate it. If I wait until later and I've already painted blue outside of it, then as soon as I grab that red, I might touch the blue and then end up contaminating it, just pull in some of that other color. But I'm trying to connect the pieces. When you're painting in watercolor, connection is really important in order to make it feel like all the shapes relate to each other. Because as soon as you have divisions between them and you're keeping each of the shapes separate from each other and trying to kiss edges together too much, you end up in all kinds of trouble because kissing edges is really difficult. There's a couple places I'm going to have to do that in this painting. I couldn't work out how not to. Not with this completely different colored buoy. If it was a yellow buoy, I might have been able to just kind of splooge some of that color into at least that top section. But I didn't want to splooge any red in there and then try to go over it with the blue water, because then that would change the color of it too much. So I decided I'm going to have to paint right around it with a kissed edge. So I've added some clean water to this to try to let gravity bring down some of that paint and just kind of push it down lower to give me more of a highlight, and then add in a bit of darkness because there's a little more value right by where it connects to whatever that black thing is. I don't know what they call that. The handle, the connector, the whatever it is. And, trying to create some light on it wasn't doing all that great. I was a little bit worried with this not having, had a lot of success painting with reds. I've never found reds that I loved, except for Quin Rose and Anthraquinoid Scarlet. I've tried so many reds in my palette, and I finally had to bring Anthraquinoid Scarlet back because I didn't like any of the other reds I've been trying. So it's still not perfect, and I wanted something that would feel that electric that you can see in the photo. And maybe somebody else has an idea if there's a better color, if there's something else to do. I know some people will suggest opera and using opera, but what'll happen is opera pink will fade. And if I mix that with something else like the new Gamboge to try to orange it up, then I could end up with something that just looks like new Gamboge. And all that pink will disappear because it's not light fast. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to leave this and let it go. And in my head, a lot of times, I will tell myself as I'm doing my first painting of a subject that, if this one doesn't work out, I'm going to consider it practice. And, I will have tried something here in order to get this red to look the way it does. And if it works, great. And if it doesn't, oh well. In this particular case, it got lighter. It looked brighter as the rest of the painting happened. And that's because everything is in context with everything else. In addition to the fact that watercolor will dry back like a good 30% or so. Some colors more so than others. And this one, at this point, I decided I wanted to put some of those markings almost in. There's some horizontal lines in it. And I got them a little too much on the sharp side. So I tried using just water to soften it. And eventually, once I got it to where I wanted it, I just had to get out the dryer to set it right where it is. But it took me a little bit to get there. I decided to add a little bit of the dark color that I wanted to put in between the two of them, that shadow underneath of the thing, just because it was still wet. And if it was still wet, then I could at least get some soft edges and then add a hard edge if I need to later. But I, wanted to see if I could do that without making a giant mess. Not always possible, but I wanted to see if I could do it. And then I started working on this bottom section because the reflection, once it gets past the redness of that buoy, does connect to the shadows that are in the reflection from the boat, or I guess the reflection, not the shadows. So I decided to put that dark in there too, so I could get a little bit of that blending, get some soft edges on there. And the red went a little too far, but I think that'll be okay by the time I put the water in on that other side of it. So took some leftover mush in my palette, and just darkened that area underneath of the reflection of the buoy and dried it. So I was a little worried that if I didn't dry it right away, I was going to end up regretting it, because you do end up getting hard edges sometimes, and then you have to fix that later. All right, next up is the other bright thing that I wanted to make sure I get in there really carefully, is that band across the boat. So I loved that pop of that bright color, and it's in shadow, and you'll see how I end up showing that it's in shadow later in end of the painting. But look how nice this brush just holds so much pigment and can make that nice big long shape. Kind of nice. I could get used to this brush, I think. It does take a lot of practice, so unless you're painting large like this is a quarter sheet of a 22 by 30 sheet, so 15 by 11. So if you're painting small, this will not be a great brush to use. As you saw on the thumbnails, if you watch the previous video, you can get tiny details, and you'll be able to see me do tiny details here, but it's a lot of work, and I would recommend a smaller brush for smaller paintings. I did see throughout the rest of the top of the boat some other of this bright blue color. Some of it is just around the edges where all the metal meets metal and that sort of thing. There's some some of the shadows there look more bluish than they do, grayish. So I thought I'll put some of those in there while I don't have any other colors interacting with it, because I can leave these. They will be dry by the time I paint anything next to them. So I'm not going to risk one color just bleeding into another and making a huge mess. There are also some bright blue areas on that left side of the boat. And, whether that's painted that way or it's just the way the shadows look, it was worth putting that color in there because I can always go over it with something else. But I can get this part done before I contaminate it with anything else, and then be sure that I leave these colors once I start putting something else in there. But here's where I'm just getting kind of scrubby. Remember in the sketch when I talked about making not really specific lines, not worried about what the back of that boat looks like? I just was going to throw in some lines. That's kind of what I meant. So putting the blues in here now doesn't preclude me adding more later. It just means that I'm not going to forget to put them in the important places. So next up is mixing up some color for that background. And that's where I'm hoping that this brush is going to save my bacon, because I have always stunk at really big washes. And if you know my paintings, I'm always trying to do big washes. I like contrast, I like having value, and it's always difficult. It takes me many, many layers on top of each other to get anything to work. But what this brush looks like it's going to do is to help me to overcome the inability to make large washes, because I like things with contrast, and I like to have a nice big area that I can just play around in and let color move across the page and fill it with color. And most brushes don't put out enough liquid and enough paint to really get the paper covered and to keep it wet so you can keep manipulating it. Now, there are some of my favorite painters who have way more expensive brushes than I can afford, and I wish I could have their brushes that would do this. This one seems like a reasonable priced one to accomplish this. But it takes a lot to get used to it, so I'll just put that caveat out there for you. So I'm mixing a couple of different colors in here. In that wall, I can see that there's some of that bright bluish color that is desaturated. So it's the same kind of color, but it's knocked back quite a ways. And so I want to have some of that in there, but I also want to have some that's going to feel blackish, more bluish than blackish, because I don't tend to like having like solid black. This is just some almost straight up Paynes blue-gray that I'm trying to keep everything wet because I didn't put enough pigment down. But boy, this brush can put pigment out. I have not had a brush that does that nearly as well. So that had me excited at this moment of the painting, like maybe I can do this after all. Part of me thought that I should probably start with that wash in case it doesn't go well. I don't waste my time on everything else. Although, if you are trying it and that wash goes badly, then proceed with the rest of the painting and use the rest of the painting as practice for the rest of the elements, and then go back and restart and try to do the wash in the background. Because that's what I find if I proceed with the piece of paper. Even if I just tell myself it's going to be a practice sheet, it's fine, then I will learn something from it so that when I do tackle that painting again, I'm going to have a much better idea how to approach it. So here you can't see behind my big fat hand, but I'm working that brush around the details of the boat and the buoy. And I should say not the details of it, but the shape of it. And this is where I talk a lot about trying not to have shapes that kiss each other. And this buoy, unfortunately, has to be kissed. When you're painting like this blue around the red, if you overlap the blue onto the red, you're going to get a heavy line. The best bet you can try for, and if you can do that, great. I was really making it work to try to use this brush. I probably could have used a smaller brush and left a white highlight on the top. But that wasn't possible by the time I moved the brush around because I'm not expert at enough at this brush to make it do exactly what I want. But I got pretty close. But I didn't want to overlap the blue onto the red and get that line. But fortunately, that's the only place that I have a kissing problem that I know of in this painting. And when I was doing the practice paintings and the thumbnails, that's when I realized that could be a problem. So when you do that kind of a thing before you start your painting, you'll know where the trouble spots are. And you'll know, okay, maybe I need to switch brushes in this moment. For me, I just wanted to see if I could do it with this brush, so there you go. The background is still very wet. So you can see I'm getting very soft edges. And the table, by the way, is tipped. If you saw the clip at the beginning of this video, I have my desk tilted up when I'm painting. And tilting it up means I've got gravity working in my favor. So the colors in here are moving. If you have your paper flat, you won't always get that movement. So if you're trying to, get some of those things to blend, then you can put something under your board even. Sometimes before I had this desk that rises, I would just put a little bottle of masking fluid or something underneath of it and lean it on that so that, everything was up by a couple inches, about a 30-degree angle or something so that the paint would move. But I just was kind of playing around with putting different colors in here, some blue, some, this is French Ultramarine blue, transparent red oxide, and some Paynes blue gray. And I can go back in and rework some of that, which it is going to need to, because sometimes you can't tell when it's still wet, whether it's going to look smooth when it dries or not. And I was looking at it with a light coming on it, and the light was shining on the wet paint, and I didn't notice that there was some, what I can see right now in the film is all of the brush strokes that are showing in that flat part of the water at the bottom, but I'll show you how I fix that when we get to that portion. So next is the inside of the boat. And remember, I wanted to make the inside of the boat, if you watched the other video, wanted to make the inside a different color and value than the background, because I don't want to make it look like there's a giant hole in the boat where you're seeing through to the other side. So wanted to fill it in first, and I love that this brush just makes a nice wide stroke to fill it in. There's nothing that kills me more than using my smaller brushes and then having 100 brush strokes show when I wanted a nice smooth flat area. And I'm going to break this section up with some darker pigments, but it's so nice to just have something that paints a straight up nice flat wash and does it in one fell swoop like this. It does, when you're working like this on an angle, it does gather all that pigment at the bottom of the shape. So unless you want that there, you can tilt the board and, raise it up and push the paint in the other direction if you want to smooth it out more. I knew I was going to be putting so much in here, I wasn't too worried about it. So mixing up a little more of that really dark value so I can start dropping some in while this is still wet. And that's going to give me soft edges. And I can add later some hard edges, but if I can do some soft ones, then it gives me the option, because maybe this will dry perfectly and I won't feel the need to add anything extra in there, and maybe it will. And that I won't know till it's dry. So I had a little spot there that I was like, oh, I should change the shape of that buoy just a little while I have this color in my brush. It was like big danger moment. Be very careful. I did not want to switch to other brushes. So next up is trying to paint in some shapes on the top of the buoy, whatever that little cap thing is that it's attached to. And again, smaller brush might help, but it kept me from getting fussy with my shapes. It made it so that I had to make nice, big, chunky shapes, and I could get skinny lines, so it wasn't as though I couldn't get some detail, but I didn't get lost in getting out a number 2 brush to try to draw all of the texture into a piece of rope. That's what I used to do a lot, and it was so hard. So I added a little bit of, interest to that because I had just painted a really thick, dark pigment. I added interest by adding in a little bit of water into the paint, introduced water into it, and then just dabbed it off so I get a little different value. And at least that's different, even if I didn't have a whole lot more else going on in it. Then dried everything completely, like 100%, so it's bone dry. How do you know when it's bone dry? Well, you can, of course, touch it and find out. But if it's still warbly, if the paper is still warpy, then there's still moisture in it, even if it feels dry, because it might feel hot and dry if you're using a hairdryer or a heat setter or heat gun like mine. And you want it to be dry. And some papers will still, after you're using a heat gun with them, they'll still be warpy, even if you leave them for days. But arches and good watercolor papers, I find, they do dry really flat. So you want to make sure it's completely dry if you want to work on it again and put more layers of paint on it. And this tape that I use is artist tape, and it's not cheap tape, but I love that it cleans up. So I can see where my edges are and I can see what the painting looks like without being interfered with the rest of the tape. A lot of tapes, when you use different kinds of masking tapes and stuff, you just can't see bupkis because you just have all that like blue or green or yellow color. And I like seeing the nice crisp white outline because I can see what my painting looks like without other colors interfering with it. So I wanted to clean this up, and I decided to paint some water into it so I could introduce more values. But my brush and my water jug was so dirty that it actually came out I was painting in some gray colors, which was fine because of what's there. But I also started realizing that whole background is not dark enough either. And even though I'm looking at it here on camera and I know that this is blown out a little bit just because it was a sunny day when I was filming, it was definitely needing a little bit more TLC. So I made some very, very thick paint, the same colors, using Ultramarine blue and the transparent red oxide. Why I could never think of transparent red oxide in my brain when I try to talk is beyond me. But here I could make those soft edges again by painting water into the area first. So if you want hard edges, then paint on dry paper. But if you want soft edges, just put a very light wash. Don't get crazy and scrub at it because you'll lift up all the color under it. But if you want to just go over it very simply with water, you can drop color in. Or here, I'm just putting another wash of color over this because when I was looking at the photo, I realized how much darker the value needed to be overall. And at the end of the painting, I'll be doing a little bit more detail work in that background. But for now, I just wanted to get that thing nice and dark. But notice I'm going around the edges real carefully with my brush. Every time you have to add more on top. And I really wish I could get to the point where I get the right value the first time because I just can't seem to. I end up, unfortunately, trying to paint the same edge over and over and over again. And it's very difficult to paint that same edge unless it's dark. And so if you're trying to paint like a light red and a medium red or a purple and a orange or something next to each other, it's really difficult to get that edge to look clean. So for something like this, I wasn't too worried because I could always bring that edge into the boat a little bit more if I need to. But I knew I was going to do more work in that background, but I didn't want to do it till I got the rest of the painting done, just so I could see what I was contrasting with. So next up is this water on this left-hand side. Now you might think that water is awful light. It's not as light as the top of the boat. There is value in there. So I'm starting with just water, clean water. Well, it's not totally clean water because it's my water jug. But I'm painting clean water in there, and then I'm going to paint in some color. Now, the light color, this bright blue that you can see in there, There's not as much of it, of course, as there is in the paint on that boat, but that's the color of the sky reflecting in the water. And we want this to eventually look like it's reflecting clouds down into the water, which would be kind of cool if you could make it look that way. So leaving some openings, just putting in some chunks of, pretend like you're painting an upside down sky, I guess. Leaving some chunks of white in there. And then in order to keep the horizontalness of the flow of the water, I'm just going to use a baby wipe and lift up some of that paint. Because I wanted it to be light. I can always add more later. So I wanted to start with something very light and see how that plays out later on when I get to the rest of the painting being done. And I can even add in a little bit more of other colors if I want, because this is still wet. So I can put in just a few waves in this very, very wet pigment and get some super soft edges, and do the same thing. Use that baby wipe to move things around a little bit. I use a baby wipe as opposed to a paper towel because a baby wipe has moisture in it. And so a paper towel can sometimes introduce some really hard edges and some harsh, like almost scraping the paint on the paper, whereas you'll get more soft type of look when you start working on it with a baby wipe. But there's going to be those reflections coming down over top of it anyway, so I'm not overly worried about what that looks like in terms of trying to make it all look perfect. Just wanted to have some good value in there. So now I finally get to move on to the boat. And you might think, gee whiz, that boat is white. It should be white. No, 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 no. The boat is not all white. The top of the boat is white. And even the top of it, there is some value in there. There is some color on the top of that boat. And I was looking for where the darker places are. There's even some brown on there, like some rusty spots that I'll get on there later. And I'm just going to try to put a very soft bit of the really pale blue value on the top of the boat. And I'm just using leftover blues that are in the palette, but if you need to mix a color, again, do the French Ultramarine blue with just a tiny, tiny bit of the transparent red oxide. If you want to throw in a little bit of the iridescent electric blue, that could help. Sometimes those colors will get too bright and they feel a little bit crazy. So you can just take a drop of, well, maybe that might be a little much of a drop of transparent red oxide, and that will tone it down. See how desaturated that looks now? Whereas when I first was mixing that up, it was like screamy bright blue. So the top edge of it, I'm trying to accentuate some of the funky shapes, the kind of messy shapes that are up there, so that I don't get just a hard, solid line of white up there. And then I'm just going to continue this paint all the way down. And it can change value, it can change color and everything because it's a very light value. Just want to make sure that I capture the shapes and the reflection from this left side of the boat goes outward, because the left side of the boat goes outward facing upward, if you can see that. So it goes up to the left, so the shape of that or the shape of the reflection goes down to the left. So they mirror each other. And if you ever wonder that, then you are probably working out of your head as opposed to looking at a reference or looking at real life, because in real life you could just look at the direction that those lines follow. So up on the top here, I wanted to put a little bit more, maybe some extra value, and I wanted to make it a little more brown because I saw some of that rust in there. And I'm just going to mix up a color that's going to have a little bit more of a warm gray feel to it. Very wet and mushy. And then I'm going to try to, as much as I can, dry brush something in there so that I get a little texture and just kind of see what it looks like. Because if I keep it really light, even if I don't like it, I could lift that off in a heartbeat, some of that extra color. Now, it may not lift it all the way back to white, but I was okay with that because the top of the boat is not screamingly white anyway. So some of the areas of blue are still wet, and I'm getting some soft blends. And other than that, I can just lift up some that I got a little carried away with that dark color. But that's going to give me some nice contrast to the color in the rest of the boat, as it just warms that up. And then I wanted to work on some of the shadows down here, and there's that shadow on the left side of the boat that I wanted to put in there, and it got a little carried away. So I'm going to have to do some stuff to fix that because it was still wet. I just really wanted to throw some things in here while everything was wet so I could get some soft edges and start to define a few things that are going on in this boat and in the shadows that are underneath of it. I'm doing that with a really thin color for right now, because if I were to do those shapes in really dark colors right now, then the dark colors would be what blends in, and I didn't think I was ready for that quite yet. So I used a wipe to try to fight back some of the color that was trying to make its way up the side of the boat, that sort of thing. So sometimes you end up not waiting quite long enough, and other times you wait too long to make a shift in something, and it doesn't always work the way it ought. Now here I was trying something that actually didn't end up showing by the time I was done. I thought I'd put the shadows in for the ropes that are hanging down. And if I could get those shadows in there, and the shadow for the sign, then it would look really cool when I finally painted those in. But they just mushed so much because everything was so wet. So you may, find in different paintings that you'll want to wait different amounts of time between when you are waiting for paint to dry and then you want to add in some extra value to something. Because look how that just disappeared. It just turned into little gray blobs. But such is life, Sometimes stuff happens. So I gave it a good dry so I could move on to the next step. So I gave it all a really good dry, and it took a long time to dry just because I had so much water in there. So next up was going to be that little sign or whatever that blue thing is on the back of the boat. It could be part of the engine, but I'm just going to treat it as a panel. Looks like it has some bolts in the corners of it or something. So I'm going to paint it with a more traditional bright blue using some the French Ultramarine blue, which is in those mixes that I've been using. So even though it looks screamy bright here, it's in all these other colors. I could have dulled it down more, and I'll do some other things later to dull it down. But I also just wanted a little bit of that pop, so I thought I'd give it a try. I can always go back and darken it later. But in order to add a little bit more of that color elsewhere, because I hate having a color that's only in one spot unless it's a color of an object like the buoy, like that just needed to be the pop. But I wanted to pull some of that French Ultramarine blue in its more pure form elsewhere. So I'm going to add a bunch of it in pieces of rope, in some of the shadows around different areas of the boat, just putting that little tiny bit of extra color there and letting myself have some space to do other colors with it. So I'm not going to complete every line in the ropes that I'm doing, but I'm going to mix up, another color, some of the transparent red oxide this time, so that I get a duller color, and I'll continue some of the different shadow shapes and some of the different ropes in that color, just so I get some variation. And I am running out of things to say for the moment, so until I get to the point I have something genius, I'm going to just let you listen to the harbor sounds. So here I'm adding in some more shapes, and I'm not worried about adding in anything consistent. It doesn't have to make sense. I don't need to draw in every board on whatever it is that's under there, because I can't even tell what's under there. I just want something that's going to look like there's something going on inside of the boat. And I'm trying to keep the lines of the same quality that I'm using for the ropes and some of those other elements so that they all kind of feel like they fit together. I'll do the same thing with stripes on the boat and little details of the construction of the boat, just little different places that should have the same linear quality instead of trying to come up with one area is going to be all perfect and the other areas are going to be more sketchy. Down here in the bottom of the boat, I struggled a little bit with trying to get it to be straight. Me and straight are not really good friends. But I like that my watercolors are a little wonky sometimes, so that's all right. You'll see me repair this several times. But there's two little spots on the bottom in this black bar, this black panel, that have, I don't know if it's little holes in them, but it's something lighter. And then there's a reflection in the water down below them that is the kind of the same shape. So I wanted to allow a little bit of that to show, and I also wanted the ropes to be able to crisscross over top of this big black shape. So I'm going to have to do some negative painting around it. There's also just some little openings, some little, I don't know if it's bubbles, something going on in there that I can add. I can leave a little bit of difference in those little spots because there's always something going on in the water. So I don't want everything always to be a perfect wash, and this seemed like a good place to potentially leave some openings and that sort of stuff. I can always paint over them later if they don't look right, if things look too messy. But even, if I could get some dry brush, that would really work great. But I'm looking here at my straightness, I'm going back in my brain to when I painted this a few hours ago. And yeah, I was like, oh gosh, am I going to be able to get this straight? The back end does have in its reflection a slightly different, like there's a little jog to it that comes down a little lower. And that will all kind of disappear because I'm going to darken all the value in that reflection anyway. But I'm going to use the same line to create the reflections for each of these ropes in here too, because they're going to be reflected out here. One's going to tilt a kilter. Is that, if I can even say that without tripping over my own tongue, but like trying to figure out the direction of it, like it's coming from the inside of the boat to the outside. So I'm going to make that reflection go out that direction. Remember, in this painting, I added a little bit onto the bottom of the painting. The photo reference cuts off above that. So I'm on my own for making my own reflections. But I am going to darken all this so that's not going to be as visible and crazy as it may look right now. So next I'm going to work on some more of the water and refining some of these shapes, cleaning up the value and the shapes and stuff here in this reflection, and putting a little more in the boat reflection, because all of that little fussiness at the top of the boat is what's being reflected at the bottom. And there is, in the photograph, you can see some of that small detail in there. So next up, I was going to do a little bit of the work on the squiggly reflections. And what I am learning about this brush is I have to have enough pigment on it, but I also have to have the right amount of water in it. If it's too dry, I'm not going to get a really nice, consistent linearness to it. It's going to get dry brushy quick, but I needed to have enough color in it so that it doesn't need to be gone over again. This is not something that I want to do in several layers. I want to get the value right the first time and not be trying to add more color to it. So getting the balance between the amount of water to get it to move and the amount of color was a thing. It's not going to be as dark as the values on the bottom of the boat, so it can be much lighter. These are reflections from something that's up above the dock somehow. Not sure what that is, whether it's boats from the other side or whatever, but it's just random reflections on the water. And this brush does do a pretty decent job of giving me a squiggle line. I was just, getting used to the brush and how it's moving in order to try to get that to happen. And since I moved in my composition, I moved those inward to the inner portion of the painting a little bit. I can add a bit more on the left-hand side too, just to give it a bit more interest. You might be thinking what I am, which is stop messing with the buoy. I'm sitting here watching myself do it on the replay, and I just keep playing with it. I can't stop. I can't make myself stop. Someone take the brush away. So hopefully that will be the last of it. The color I decided to mix up for going over this reflection one more time is a mix of the colors I've already had in there, which is the transparent Red Oxide and French Ultramarine, but I also added in some of the Iridescent electric blue, which pulls it a little bit more toward a green. So there's kind of some tealishness in that blue. And that started feeling better according to the photograph for what the color of that reflection is, because it's pulling in some green from the water underneath, as well as the value that's on the boat itself, which I will be dealing with in a moment as well, because that needs some adjustment. You can adjust your values and your colors when you get to the final stages like this. It just does get more dangerous to do it, because it's real easy to accidentally mess things up. But I've done it enough times that I feel comfortable kind of putting myself out there to cover things up. So I decided to paint right through some of those reflections that I had painted around earlier to try to see if I could knock those back, knock them into the deeper shadow, and add some of that, just that overall tealish kind of dirty teal color, I guess you can call it. It would be Cascade green, but dirty, I suppose. I didn't expect that Iridescent electric blue would push it that much to green, but it's really good to know that it does. And now I mixed up a nice, really dark black to start putting in some more of that detail that I had talked about earlier in the wall. And I went a little bit too low. And I had to figure out, am I going to fix it, or am I going to just let the wall go all the way down as low as that little block shows it? Because you can see there's a few really dark chunks in that wall if you really look closely at that photograph. And I wanted to just put more in that because it was going to make the boat pop more. So I just took a baby wipe and just real quickly wiped across it. And I'm going to leave it at that. I could go over that blue water if I need to. We'll see if that ends up being a problem later. But I'm going to use the same line quality, but a little chunkier in this background to add in almost something that feels like either bricks or something that it's attached to, and creating somewhat of a grid structure in certain areas and big blocks of dark in others, just to make something more interesting, because all of that color back there was fine, and it does look actually darker in my world, like in real life, than it does here. It's a little bit blown out. But it still needed a little bit extra TLC of some kind. So just adding in some splatters and various things, and then getting really nice and dark in at least a strip at the top to just push that into deeper shadow. Because that's going to start, all of that mess back there starts to add to the fact that this is an old boat tied to an old dock. And I am going to add some more messiness to that boat to make it a little older feeling. So here's where I start adjusting the back of the boat, because there's just a happier blue back there, more of that iridescent electric blue color. And it's kind of a desaturated version of it, so I'm just going to paint it right over top of everything. And since it's all dry, I can do that. This big brush, or use any like giant brush that you have, is the kind of thing you need to use at this point. Don't do anything with a tiny brush, because you're just going to add more brush strokes to it. And the thing that this can do for you is, if you've got a first wash that is fussy and has a lot of mess going on in it, if you go over it with one really simple wash, you can actually repair some of that, because it can start to almost lift the color underneath and push and pull it. But here, what I wanted it to do, in addition to making it more of that kind of bright blue color, is to give me something to put some rust into. This boat does have a little bit. I'm going to emphasize it even more, but I can put some color in it and have a little bit something interesting there to make it look like an old boat. I added some color into the interior of the boat too, so that I could add in some really strong pops of the transparent red oxide, which started making me happy because it was pulling a bit of that orange color from the buoy elsewhere into the painting, because it was feeling very, very isolated to just that one element. And even though I like it, and I'm glad that it had that pop, I also wanted a little bit of that color somewhere else in the painting. I don't like when things are just isolated to one spot. So add a little bit more underneath of the boat as well. And we're getting pretty close to finished here. I'm adding some extra color to some of the little details. So I've darkened just a few spots. And then I realized I wanted to add a little bit more to the interior of this boat. I wanted to show that the side that we're looking at is in shadow, even though it's that bright color, because that right-hand side needs to be brighter than the rest of it in order for it to look like it's curving. And that really helped to just add another layer to it. And my brush is so full of mess right now that it's really easy for any of the colors that I'm using to just quickly dirty up. And add a little bit more onto a few spots while I had that color there. Because, you know, why not add a little bit more of that and bring in some of that delightful brightness. And it you know, in combination with the transparent red oxide, just starts to feel kind of nice and sloppy, which is sort of fun. The side of the boat then started feeling like it was too bright. So every time I look at something, I think, well, that needs to be fixed. Oh, well, that needs to go darker. Well, then that thing needs to go darker. And I could fuss with a painting like this until the cows come home. But given that, you know, I don't really need any cows, I need to finish before the cows get home. So sometimes just calling it done is pretty much what I have to do. It's just to say it's finished. Because I could just sit here and play. But we've been at this for almost an hour. There's very little that was taken out of this video. I took out, you know, a few times when I was cleaning my water jar and that sort of thing. Or if I was sitting and doing too much pondering, took out some empty spots. But other than that, you got pretty much real-time stuff going on here. So now I'm going to add just a little bit more to the water because I want the color to pop over here a little bit more to balance out all the color in the boat, and painted that water into wet area so that I end up getting really, really soft, almost cloud looking types of shapes. And I think that really made it. Like that was one of my good final touches. Sometimes I look at my final touches and I think that was crazy. Why did I bother doing that? I think that one actually worked. So there is the finished boat painting. And you can see it's not tidy. Don't look at your painting too closely and worry about it being perfect and tidy, because paintings aren't that way. Paintings just do what they do, and sometimes just allowing it to be a mess is the better part of valor. And pretty much my favorite part of any painting is the tape peel. Seeing that nice clean white edge, which you can see with the tape, but really looks nice when the paper's all nice and clean there. And here we go. If you missed out on the earlier video that had the sketches in it, then please do go watch that. You will hopefully get something out of that as well after having watched this one. And they're both linked to each other in the comments down below, so you can zip back and forth to one or the other. And the supplies are listed down there, as well as a link to go get the photo on Unsplash. So I hope you enjoyed this. It was kind of an epic load of work for me to get a video done this long, but hopefully 4 of you will watch it and maybe 1 of you will try it. That would make me happy. Go give it a try. And I will see you again very soon with a silver point video, I hope. Got to figure out how to make this thing work. I'll see you guys later. Bye-bye.